Hello, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's session. I say this afternoon, it may be a different time zone for you. I'm not Franco Nasi, but Duncan Large, and I'm Academic Director of the British Centre for Literary Translation at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, England. For 4 years now, BCLT has been one of the organisers of the annual European School of Literary Translation, together with the Dutch Centre of Expertise for Literary Translation and the Italian San Pellegrino Foundation. Now, ESLT brings together around 24 translators and teachers each year to focus on teaching literary translation from a wide variety of perspectives. This year's ESLT started yesterday and runs through till Friday. Usually we meet in Rome, but for the first time this year, we're holding the event online, which means, of course, that we can spread our net rather more widely than usual. Although we're called the European School of Literary Translation, we've always had participants who come from outside of Europe, strictly defined, and this year is no different. But for this session, we've gone truly global for the first time, and we have well over 200 registered participants. If you're new to ESLT, then you can find out more about the event on our website, which is just eslt.eu. This session is set up as a Zoom webinar, so you're welcome to ask questions via the Q&A function. The session is being recorded, and the recording will be made available on the ESLT website after the event, as well as the San Pellegrino Foundation YouTube channel. The session is chaired by scholar and translator Franco Nasi, who is Associate Professor of Anglo-American Literature in the Department of Studies on Language and Culture at the University of Modena and Reggio Emilia in Italy, where he teaches Anglo-American literature and theories of translation. So without further ado, let me hand over to Franco Nasi, who will introduce our two speakers.
Thank you, Duncan. Thank you so much. Yes, I'm here only to introduce briefly our distinguished guests, and Goldstein and Jenny McPhee, who are two of the most important American literary translators from Italian into English. And well, I guess I'm also here to welcome you all to our meeting on translation and the different ways in which translation can be taught. Now, in Italian, well, Duncan has done this already, but in Italian we would say, sono qui per fare gli onori di casa, which in English would be to play host or to do the honors. But in Italian, we also have casa, sono qui per fare gli onori di casa. And in this case, I would not have to worry too much about the translation of casa, because you don't have it in English, which is quite positive indeed in this situation, since the casa we meet today is a little strange and funny and spread out as it is across the ocean. As far as I know, Anne is in the USA, Jenny is in Tuscany at the moment, I am in Emilia, Duncan is in England, and many other people are in different places. So it's a peculiar kind of house with no doors, no roof, and no real room where we can see each other. And to be honest, it's quite frustrating to talk without having the possibility to see the reaction of people, usually sitting in front of the people who are talking. But anyway, luckily, as Duncan was saying, we have a chat line, and you'll be able to pose questions, and our guests will be more than happy to answer them in the second part of our talk. So Anne and Jenny have agreed to have a conversation on translation in the first part of our meeting. This dialogue between the two will last roughly 1 hour. Then at the end, we will have a brief reading of few passages of their translations, and we'll have a 5-10 minutes of coffee break. I'm fairly sure that Duncan got in touch with Amazon and is going to deliver coffee to all the participants now attending our meeting. Then after the coffee break, correct me, Duncan, if that is not correct. In the second part, Anne and Jenny will answer your questions. This is just to give you a few indication on the playlist of our meeting. Now, as far as the introduction, well, it's very difficult to present our guest. I think that we all know how outstanding, accurate, and vital has been their work to keep our beloved Italian authors alive in a different language and culture. I'm thinking, of course, about the translations of Elena Ferrante's book, or the translation and edition of the collected works by Primo Levi and Goldstein recently published, or about Jenny McPhee's translation of Natalia Ginsburg, Family Lexicon, or Anna Maria Ortese, just to mention a few. And this list could be much, much longer, with very successful Italian books as Baricco's Silk, or Jhumpa Lahiri, in other words, translated by Anne, or Mauserig's Canone Inverso by Jenny. But they also challenged the so-called canonical writers of Italian literature as Pasolini, Ragazzi di Vita, o Leopardi, Zibaldone, and Elsa Morante's Menzogna e Sortileggio, which I think is now on Jenny's desk. So, but I think it's really better if I stop here, skipping the prizes they won and avoiding to talk about their activity as editors or critics or creative writers, because I'm sure that this part will come out during our conversation. So metaphorically, I step down and leave the floor to Jenny and Anne. Thank you.
Thank you, Franco. That was really lovely. And it's really fantastic to be here. Of course, it would be great to all be together in Rome, but this is the next best thing. And by now, Anne and I are really used to Zoom. We regularly Zoom with each other. So that's a nice thing to be able to do across the ocean. So I thought we'd just get started right away with origin story. The origin story of translators is often very idiosyncratic today, because translation in general and literary translation in particular was not something when Anne and I were young, you could go and get a degree in. You now can, and it's fantastic that that's true. But so mostly you'll hear that literary translators just kind of somehow fall into it. And I think that was both the case for both me and Anne. And so we'll start with Anne and Anne's origin story.
Yes, thank you, Franco. Thank you, Duncan. Thank you, everybody, for being here. But of course, I do wish I were in Rome, although when I'll get there, I don't know. Anyway, I'll pretend. My bookshelf, the bookshelf behind me is my Italian bookshelf, so we'll pretend. Anyway, yes, as Jenny said, most translator origin stories of the people I know anyway, or that we know, are kind of accidental. Mine, what happened in, I worked at the New Yorker for many years, and I started learning Italian quite late in life, when I was in my 30s. And, well, not late, but in the middle of the journey of my life. So I had been studying, we had a class in the office actually, and I had been studying Italian for about 5 years, maybe, yeah, something like that. And the editor of the New Yorker at the time was a man named Robert Gottlieb. And he received a book, an Italian book by a writer called Aldo Buzzi, who many Italians, I think, even are not familiar with. It was sent to him by the artist Saul Steinberg, whom you may know as the person who put New York at the center of the universe. But anyway, he knew that I was studying Italian, and he gave me the book, and he said, could you just look through this so I can say something nice to Saul? So I looked at it and I actually thought it was a wonderful book. It was called, it's called Chekhov in Sondrio, and it's really about Russian literature and Italy. And I was sort of looking at it and I thought, you know, I'm just going to try translating it, because I was studying Italian. I thought that translating it would give me another view of Italian, a more intimate look at the language, a way of sort of studying it, I don't know, more closely. And so I translated it, and then I gave it to Bob. I gave the translation to Bob, and he published it. So it was really quite accidental. So Jenny, what's your story?
Yeah, no, that's such a great story. And I just had a little question. Did the language class that you were doing at the New Yorker, was that something you all organized, or were they so enlightened at the New Yorker that they were giving language classes?
No. They were not. They were only enlightened insofar as they paid for classes. But we organized. My friend Mary Norris, whom people might know of as the Comma Queen, and I organized this language class. We found a bunch of people who were interested in learning Italian, and we organized the class. In fact, she knew someone who could teach it, and that's what we did.
Yeah, oh wow, that's a great story. Okay, so my story is that I was working at Alfred A. Knopf, and which was a publisher in New York City, and I was very interested in Italian and French, spoke Italian and French, and of course Knopf was known for its translations, but the senior editors weren't that interested in actually editing the translations. They were more interested in making the acquisition, but then they would pass the translations off to a junior editor, and that was me. And so I got to work with all sorts of fabulous, both authors and translators, you know, Garcia Marquez, Nelly de Pignon, Pierre Assolin, eventually also Pier Paolo Pasolini, which we'll get to. And so I was also, everybody knew that I knew Italian. I read all the Italian submissions and French submissions, and wrote reports on them as whether they should be published or not in America. And all of us, then one day, all of a sudden, there was lots of secrecy and lots of hurry, and they came to me and said, we're not telling you who this author is, but you have to translate these 15 pages immediately to see if this is something we want to translate. As it turns out, it was Crossing the Threshold of Hope by John Paul II. And because he was coming to town and they needed the translation done in seconds flat, they sent me home, and I worked on it for 2 months and translated that for Knopf. It wasn't the best experience of my life in terms of, it was my first full-length translation, but it wasn't the greatest book. And I thought, oh, this can't be my last experience with translation. So after that, I asked around, and the next book was Maurenzig's Canon Inverso. So that was how I got started. Then let's come back to Pier Paolo Pasolini, because that's how Anne and I met. And Anne, what year was that? It's almost scary.
I think it was like the early 90s.
It was the early 90s. And he had this great unfinished work that was Petrolio. And we needed to find a translator. And so the way it often happens is that you send out a excerpt for various translators to translate. So you decide which one. And Anne was one of the translators that we sent an excerpt to translate. And hers was just far and above everybody else's. So of course, Anne it was a really hard book to translate.
Right. But I just have to insert, I just realized that Bob Gottlieb was instrumental in that as well. Because didn't he suggested me to you, I think.
Yes, he did. That's right. Because before he went to the New Yorker, he was at Knopf.
Yeah, he was at Knopf. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's exactly right. Yeah, Bob. So then Anne and I worked very hard together on that unfinished but amazing Petrolio.
Yeah.
And that's how our big collaboration over the years has started.
Yeah.
So we used to speak a little bit about what it was like to translate that book?
Petrolio?
Yeah.
Well, it was only my second translation. And I knew nothing about Pasolini. Pasolini is really not known in America as a novelist or even as a writer, really. So, you know, he's known as a filmmaker. So I knew nothing about him as a novelist. I really knew nothing about the politics of Italy in the 1960s and 70s, which is one of the major themes of that book, or anything else. So it was really an unbelievable education. And I didn't even, you know, I mean, I knew Italian, but his Italian is really something else. You know, it's very complicated. This was not finished, as Jenny said. He left all kinds of like word choices that he hadn't decided on yet in the text. So it was really quite an adventure, I have to say, but I learned so much.
It's true. You know, I translated an unfinished work by Malaparte.
Oh, right.
Cremino. And it was this, I actually found it really incredible to translate something unfinished. It teaches you so much about just literature in general, but also about translation.
Yeah.
Because translation itself is all about the mechanics of language on one level. And there you're really getting into the mechanics even more because it's so raw. So that,
right.
I find unfinished stuff kind of interesting to translate.
Yeah.
So you stayed involved in Pasolini studies, and you've translated a lot of things around Pasolini, including Emanuele Trevi's work, his account of working at the Pasolini Foundation. Will you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, first I just should say, I mean, Pasolini, it's something that gives you a kind of foundation in some way, because it's always he's always recurring. I mean, you always, you know, there are references all the time. I just a couple of years ago, I happened to be in Rome, and I walked up to the Palatine, and there was an art show, and there was a video work by a British artist based on Petrolio. So it was, you know, it's just always around. And in the book of Emanuele Trevi, Qualcosa di Scritto, is kind of an amazing book about his obsession with Petrolio, really, and the Laura Betti, who was the actress who was very close to Pasolini. But it's a book that's really about Rome. It's about sort of tracking Petrolio through Rome. It's his own coming of age story. It's got, you know, literary criticism. It's really quite a remarkable book, I think. But anyway, Pasolini. And then I also translated or retranslated Ragazzi di Vita, which was another complex project, although it was finished.
But aren't they all complex in the end? I mean,
yes,
you know, every time you think, oh, it's going to get easier, it'll be different. Yeah. It's just always so complex to translate. Even, well, we'll get to that in a minute, but even translating the same author, you know, it's not as if, you know, necessarily, but I'm going to ask you about that in a second.
Okay.
Next, I wanted just to get through our sort of trajectory.
Oh, yeah.
As translators. So the next project that we worked on, or that you actually were the editor on, on the new translation of the entire works of Primo Levi, except for
Questo è un uomo.
Questo è un uomo.
Yeah.
I'm just stumbling because it's got a couple of different translations in English, right? If this is a man, but it was also something else.
Survival in Auschwitz.
Survival in Auschwitz.
That was its original English title, because they thought people thought they needed something hopeful.
Right. Interesting. So anyway, I was living in England at the time, and I was back just for a brief visit in New York, and just as will happen in New York, I saw Anne at the 42nd Street subway, and I just had this really difficult experience translating somebody who was sort of a friend and alive, And so she had objected to just about everything that I did in the translation, and it had been quite a difficult experience. And so Anne, sees me, hi, how are you? What are you doing? What are you translating? And I said, I don't know, but whatever I do, from now on, only dead people am I translating. And she says, how about Primo Levi? And disappears onto the subway. So immediately I get home and email her, what do you mean, Primo Levi? And she said, I'm doing this big project, and would you do a couple of books? So I did do a couple of shorts, translations of 2 collections of short stories in that in that project. Now, what I wanted to ask Anne is, what was it like to be editing? There were 4 or 5 of us, right?
There were actually 8.
8. Okay, so what was it like to edit 8 different translators' voices?
It's very hard to say at this distance, but it was a challenge. But it wasn't, in a way, it wasn't that difficult. First of all, because Primo Levi is such a beautiful writer, and such a clear, straightforward writer, on the surface anyway, that in that sense, Levi holds his own, no matter who no matter who's translating. But I had a few ideas in my mind of clarity, of accuracy, of not straying far from the text, and I sort of applied those rules, those guidelines as I corrected all the, corrected in the sense of edited all the translations. And what I did was, Europa Editions, the publisher of Ferrante, had this system, which most American publishers don't have, of having someone who knows both languages edit the books, essentially, copy edit and edit the translations. So I applied I also applied that guideline, and I checked I checked the translations and edited them. And in some ways, I think that was helpful in terms of keeping to my idea of accuracy and clarity, and truthfulness to the text. I don't mean that they needed to be literal, but they had to not be rewritings in a sense, or total rewritings. And luckily, most of the people who did the translations were just naturally that type of translator, and besides, they were friends of mine. So I think it worked out really well. Well, I hope it did. But it was a huge project.
It was. So yeah, Gregory Rabassa once said that the better the writer, the easier it is to translate, which is kind of true, because your choices get a little bit, they're fewer. I think they're fewer.
Yeah,
and the writing is really, really good.
Yeah.
Because it just seems like whatever, it's sort of inevitable. It's still hard, but you're sort of guided more toward something, more specific. It's true. But still, do you think that, this is a hard sort of question, but do you think that the individual translators' voices, did you have to kind of edit those out so that there was one distinct?
A little bit, I think. With some of the translators, I think I did. I think you and I are pretty much, even though we'll talk about our differences, but we have a similar attention to the text, and I think most of the other translators did, or if they didn't, I whipped them into shape. But yeah, it's hard to. It's of course, I think each book probably has its own voice, as well as having Primo Levi's voice and my voice.
Right. All the voices are there. It's just making them all sing together in some fabulous way, which I think is what happened with that project. It's just amazing.
Yeah.
So, so when I was still at Knopf, back in 2002, I did a reader's report on a book, a little book out of Italy called I giorni dell'abbandono. And I said, you must publish this book. It's so wonderful. I still have the reader's report. And they said, oh, it's too small. No, we're not going to do that. So tell us a little bit about how you came to first translate Elena Ferrante.
Well, actually, yeah, I mean, well, again, you know, it's all, I mean, somewhat by chance, but not totally. When in the early 2000s, when the Sandro and Sandra Ferri decided to start, the owners of Edizione EO in Italy decided to start publishing books in English. And in fact, to open basically a branch of their publishing company, an Anglophone branch. They decided that the first book they would publish was I giorni dell'abbandono, which they had published in Italy and I think was quite successful in Italy. It was kind of a smart move. But anyway, they were looking around for a translator, and they had about 5 people do samples. And this was another.
What year was this?
This was 2000. This was the early 2000s. It must have been. It was 2004, actually.
And 4. Okay.
Yeah, it was 2004 because the Days of Abandonment came out in English in 2005, so I did that translation, and it actually, I think the book did pretty well here. And, you know, it wasn't a blockbuster like.
No, but it did well.
But it did well. I mean,
and it was their first book, right?
And it was the first book that Europa Editions published in English, or that Europa Editions published. Yeah. So Knopf made a little bit of a mistake.
They certainly did. It's sort of relatively unusual that a translator gets to or is able to translate the same author over a career, and you're getting to do this for Ferrante, and I was just wondering what that's like to be so incredibly involved for such a long time with the same author. Is that a privilege? Is there a burden aspect to it? Is it, how is that for you?
You know, I never really thought about it until you raised the question. I mean, I always thought that I would feel, and I do, I guess, I just feel kind of proprietary about it, that once you become involved with an author, it should be your author. Of course, if you look around, you see that most writers have been translated by many different translators, and the translators sometimes they work together, sometimes they consult with each other. I mean, it seems it's I guess it's more collaborative or in some way, but I feel like if it's my writer, it's my writer.
That's this kind of publisher, or that probably comes a lot from also being at the New Yorker, and this relationship between editors and
it is a kind
authors.
Yeah, and then sometimes these relationships break off. I mean, I translated, Aldo Buzzi, the first writer that I translated several books of his, and suddenly he didn't want me anymore.
Well, it happens with editors too. I mean, it's tough. It's tough, or
it's difficult. But while it's going on, I felt that I should be his translator.
And then there are all sorts of rights issues as well, and also certain authors are also then they move publisher, and then the publisher has their own translator that they really like. So,
I mean, what authors have you? Well, Ginsberg. Lots of people have translated Ginsberg.
Exactly, and every time, I mean, I'm so happy that Ginsberg just gets translated as much as possible, but I understand that proprietary.
Yeah, you should be the one doing it.
Oh, but I wanted to do that. But you can't do it all, right?
No, and it's also true that you can't do it all.
And
like we're sharing Elsa Morante.
And we're sharing Elsa Morante. Of course, I took on the 800-page tome that I'm never going to finish. But and by the way, just for the audience, behind me is La Stanza di Elsa Morante at the Biblioteca Nazionale in Rome. So there's a theme. Let's talk a minute about our collaboration on Orteses. So we've been collaborating on and off in various ways as during our careers. And then we decided that actually we wanted to take this collaboration further and actually really translate something together. So Elena Ferrante has mentioned that Anna Maria Ortese, a Neapolitan writer, was very influential, along with Elsa Morante, on her work. And so Anne and I thought, or no, I guess somebody came to us.
Didn't they come to you?
Yeah, they came to us. And then we just thought, yeah, let's do this together. And so we actually translated that book in Mare non Bagno, Napoli, together. So you want to speak a little bit, Anne, about our process?
Well, it's a book of stories. So in some ways it was easy to divide starting out. We just divided the stories randomly. We each did a rough draft. We swore that it would be a really rough draft. I mean,
embarrassing, kind of embarrassing, naked, just showing how awful you are.
Right.
Draft.
And then we switched, and we each took the other half. And I think we did that a couple of times, didn't we? We went back and forth.
At least. Yeah. To the point where we didn't. I can't tell you which story I.
You can't tell which story I don't know which story I did. I started with, and we would put queries in the text and to each other. But one of the wonderful things about working with somebody else is there's always a point where you think, should I use this word or that word? And you could say, instead of racking your brains and going crazy over it, you could just say, Jenny. I could say, Jenny, which word?
Yeah.
So it was actually a great experience.
It was really fun.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting things about that translation too was all the dialect. So in the Ferrante book, she talks a lot about dialect, but she doesn't actually use the dialect. Whereas Ortese really uses the dialect a lot. So we did have to do quite a bit of there were lots of times when neither of us really knew, but you had friends in Naples and who could ask about the dialect. And it was interesting that some of your friends from one side of Naples would say it meant one thing, and others from another side of Naples would say it meant something else.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
It really meant a lot of research to try and figure
that out. Yeah.
That was really fun. Okay, so that, it more or less brings us up to the present. I'm doing a Morante novel, and you did L'Isola di Arturo. So we have our Morante thing going. So let's get a little bit to teaching. So you don't formally teach translation, but you have done seminars now and again. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit about your relationship to the teaching of translation.
I mean, I guess I can't see myself as a teacher, so I have a hard time teaching. I don't know. I've never taught, in other parts of my life, so I had no basis for it. And my one major experience was didn't work out too well. I didn't really know what I was doing.
Yeah, well, sometimes that's how you get
sometimes you figure it out, but I don't think I ever really figured it out. Couldn't quite figure out. I think teaching translation seems very difficult to me, except by doing, by translating, and then talking about the translation and talking about why you chose why you made the choices that you made. I mean, that's really the only way I can imagine it. But I know that that you have a lot of other things that you do, because I took your syllabus.
So a big question always, which is always a question for creative writing as well, is can literary translation, can creative writing be taught? So do you have an answer to that?
Do I? No, I don't. I mean, again, it's sort of, you could say I grew up before the days of when creative writing was taught very much. It's similarly with translation. I mean, I think I actually took a translation class in college. I think you know, there were classes in translation, but they weren't formal. They weren't really formally geared to something. They were really more like reading classes in a way. People would, you know, had all different languages. They were studying. They were talking about the structure of the work of literature. You know, it was really more of a literature class than a translation class, I would say.
So my father, who's a writer and has published more books than I can count, and has been teaching at Princeton for 30 years, writing, creative writing. When I ask him this question, he says, you know, the bottom line finally is that writing teaches writing. And I kind of feel that too. You know, the basis is translation teaches translation. So the more that you do it, just as you were saying, the more you learn. So of course, the activity of it is part and parcel of the learning of it. So I think those two things, the doing and the studying, have to go hand in hand. And so that's where I would begin with sort of a philosophy of teaching translation. Mm-hmm. So what are some of the preliminary competencies one has to master before engaging with literary translation was a question that was passed on to me. And so do you have thoughts about that? Do you have thoughts about
I don't know. I mean, obviously you have to know the language. But of course you have to know your
Maybe
own.
not necessarily. Sometimes I teach in my class that you don't actually need.
Oh, well, well, how about, let me put it this way. You have to know the language that you're translating into.
Absolutely.
And that's really crucial. And I think that apart from writing, reading is really important. I used to always, when I went to Italy, well, I mean, I still do, I guess. I would always take a book, you know, a book in English. So that if I was working in Italy, I'm translating from Italian. I mean, of course, it's great to work in Italy to have Italian around you, but you also need to have the English in your ear in some way. So I would take, you know, I don't know, like Henry James or something, you know, some English, some classic English writer, I think, and just to know that. I mean, just to have that. So that's one thing.
Right.
I don't know, what else, what other things did you think of?
Okay, so I mean, and just thinking in my my teaching, so in the big picture, what I try to teach, sort of on a global emotional level, is one, to bring them to a place where they have confidence in themselves as translators, because the world is wide open there as a translator. I mean, you know, your choices are so wide in a way. And it's easy to feel very intimidated and very nervous and very like, oh my God, I'm translating this great novelist, or I'm translating this author who's worked so hard on this book forever. What if I really mess it up? So, you know, one of the things is to bring up a student's level of confidence. And how I try and do that is by giving them, or by, you know, hammering the tools of translation, which basically are the tools of writing, which are, you know, really good grammar, punctuation, knowing editing. Editing is so important. So I think all of these things that I'm saying, these tools, you had in spades by being an editor at the New Yorker for how many ever years. So there's a big confidence that you have in your mastery of English.
Right, that's true.
which allows you to be a really good translator. So, I mean, there I would say those competencies. Then, you know, as I've gone on teaching, I have seen the real importance of trusting intuition. So you don't think about intuition so much in terms of you know, being a translator, but actually intuition and how something sounds is really fundamental, I think, to a good translator.
Well, when I once gave or I've given this talk on translation, and I analyzed 2 sentences. Actually, they were sentences of Primo Levi's. I went back and I figured out like how I had made all the decisions in those 2 sentences. And it turned out that, in fact, intuition was a large part of it, much more than I expected. So yeah. It's interesting.
It is really interesting. It took me a long time to really understand that
yeah.
was a competency.
Yeah, exactly.
And yeah, and then the last thing, and I think this is sort of the most important thing that I can try and teach my students more so, is interesting, more so to the undergraduates at Princeton than to the master's students at NYU. And that's how to fail. Like, just, you need to do it wrong, you need to do it badly, you need to fail a lot before you get to something that's really singing off the page. And if you can't be bad, as we were saying in our first draft, right? If you can't really do a very bad draft and see a really bad sentence on the page, you're never going to get to the good sentence.
Yeah,
so
that's very true.
So yeah, so those were some of some of the competencies. So then sort of the last issue I wanted to talk about a little bit was degree programs, which we did touch on a little bit, but it's changed, the landscape has changed so extraordinarily in the United States. I think this was already happening in Europe for a really long time, but in the United States, it was almost impossible to get a degree in translation. They barely taught translation. I'm interested to hear that you actually took a translation course, or literature and translation, or was it actually?
Yeah, it was a translation class. I mean, this was quite some years ago.
Yeah.
But
you know, maybe in Comp Lit or something, there would be the odd translation class.
Yeah.
There's not a discipline.
No, there was not. It wasn't a discipline. And if you think about it, translate also, I mean, the translators themselves were sort of forgotten.
Completely. You know, the plumbers that get no credit anywhere, right? They sort of wanted to ignore the fact that books were translated.
Yeah.
So really not ignore. They actually wanted to deny it because they had this idea, and it's still lingering, that if it's a truly successful translation, it's as if it were written in English.
Yeah.
And so you want to get rid of the whole translation apparatus.
False analysis.
Yeah. So no, but I think it's just, you know, fantastic that translation is having both in the university level, but also on a cultural level.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think they support each other, or they urge on each other.
And I just wonder a little bit, do you think, you know, the phenomenon of Ferrante and Nausgaard, and where the translation really is part and parcel of the whole experience, has helped to change this?
Well, I think so. I mean, of course, I like to think that the fact that, especially with Ferrante, there is no author. There's only the translator in English. Well, in any language, there's no author, but particularly in English, there is a translator. And so, you know, I'm often called on to do things that the writer of a book would normally do. And I mean, when this started happening, I was completely shocked. And I said, why, you know, what do you want with a translator? But then I realized that actually was really a great thing for translators, because it brings attention to the fact that you're reading this book because somebody else brought it to you. Not only the author, of course, wrote it. There's no book without the author, but somebody else was the means by which you are reading this book. And I thought that was, I think it's been good for translators in general.
So, wow, that's so interesting, and I love that. And do you think that was part of Ferrante's project to begin with?
I don't know. She does have, in one of her Guardian columns, she does have this little sort of translators are the heroes of the world kind of thing.
Yes, so, that's right. That's
right. I don't know. I think that Natasha Wimmer, who translated Bolaño, had a similar kind of experience of representing the author who was dead.
Right.
Yeah, so I think we talked about that once, but anyway. So it's, you know, sometimes the absent writer is good for translation.
Yeah, no, that's terrific.
Yeah.
So, well, we're getting sort of toward the time for our reading. We could also, so Franco, do you think we should do the readings from our, so Anne and I thought we would just read a little tiny one-page excerpt from our present projects.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
And we asked Franco if he would read the Italian.
I'll try to. We already have a few questions, so we can do the reading, have the break, and then get ready for the answer. Is that okay? Okay.
Okay.
Would you like to begin with which one of the two?
Which with Ferrante or with Morante maybe?
Maybe Morante to Ferrante, so we
Yeah.
go
Yeah,
chronologically.
chronologically.
Okay.
And Duncan put something in the chat right now, which I saw about the Petra framework. And yeah, I was thinking very much about that being intuition and confidence, also being very much part of the competencies that one would need and one should incorporate into any kind of teaching framework. So I just wanted to answer Duncan on that.
Yeah.
Okay, should I go with the reading then of Elsa Morante? So it's just one page and the beginning. Una sepolta viva e una donna perduta. Sono già 2 mesi che la mia madre adottiva, la mia sola amica e protettrice, è morta. Quando, rimasta orfana dei miei genitori, fui da lei, raccolta e adottata, entravo appena nella fanciullezza. Da allora, più di 15 anni fa, avevamo sempre vissuto insieme. La nuova luttuosa ormai si è sparsa per l'intera cerchia delle sue conoscenze. E cessate ormai da tempo le casuali visite di qualche ignaro che durante i primi giorni veniva ancora a cercare di lei, nessuno sale più a questo vecchio appartamento dove sono rimasta io sola. Non più di una settimana dopo i funerali, anche la nostra unica domestica, da poco assunta al nostro servizio, si licenziò con una scusa, mal sopportando, immagino, il deserto e il silenzio delle nostre mura, già use alla società e al frastuono. Ed io, sebbene l'eredità della mia protettrice mi consenta di vivere con qualche agio, non desidero provvedermi di nuova servitù. Da varie settimane dunque vivo rinchiusa qua dentro, senza vedere alcun viso umano, fuori di quello della portinaia, incaricata di recarmi le spese, e del mio riflesso nei molti specchi della mia dimora. Talora, mentre mi aggiro per le stanze in ozio, il mio riflesso si fa incontro a tradimento. Io sussulto al vedere una forma muoversi in queste funebri acque solitarie. E poi, quando mi riconosco, resto immobile a fissare me stessa, come se mirassi una medusa. Guardo la gracile, nervosa persona infagottata nel solito abito rossigno. Non mi curo di portare il lutto. Le trecce torreggianti sul suo capo in una foggia antiquata e negligente, il suo volto patito dalla pelle alquanto scura e gli occhi grandi e accesi che paiono sempre aspettare incauti apparizioni. E io mi domando, chi è questa donna? Chi è questa Elisa? Non di rado, come solevo già da bambina, torco la vista dal vetro, nella speranza di vedervi rispecchiata, appena lo riguardi, una tutt'altra me stessa, poiché scomparsa la mia seconda madre, la sola cui piacque di lodarmi e perfino di giudicarmi bella, rinasce in me e si rafforza ogni giorno l'antica avversione per la mia propria figura.
Thank you, Franco. That reminds me just how beautiful Italian is, but also how important it is to read aloud. Anything you write or translate, it has a whole, you can hear all the rhythms, and it was just beautiful. Okay, so this is from the novel that I'm translating, which is 800 pages long. It's Elsa Morante's first novel. It has a previous translation, but the previous translation left out huge chunks all the way through the novel. Here and there, just whenever the translator or the editor, I don't know, felt like it, they just didn't translate. Lines, paragraphs, chapter, well, not a whole chapter, it would be like half a chapter. So and at the time, Morante was very upset about the translation and that this was her being represented to the English-speaking world, and she wanted nothing to do with it. And since then, this was in 1949, there has been no translation. So I am very happy to be doing this. So my provisional title, but I keep going back and forth on this. Oh, the previous one was called House of Liars. I'm thinking of lies and enchantments, but sometimes I think of lies and sorcery, but we'll see what happens. Anyway, this is the very beginning of the novel, Introduction to the Story of My Family, Chapter 1. One woman dead, another buried alive. It's already been 2 months since my adoptive mother, my only friend and protector, has died. When, as a young girl, I was orphaned over 15 years ago, she took me in and adopted me, and we lived together ever since. By now, her entire circle of friends and acquaintances have learned about the tragedy, and even the occasional visits from those who hadn't yet heard the news have stopped. Now no one comes up to the old apartment where I live entirely alone. Even our one servant, who'd been recently hired at that, invented some excuse or other and quit less than a week after the funeral, unable to tolerate, I imagine, the emptiness and silence contained within these walls, which were once so accustomed to crowds and pandemonium. And even if the inheritance left to me by my guardian permits me to live with relative ease, I have no desire to hire a new servant. I've been living shut up in here for weeks now, without seeing any human face, besides that of the concierge, whom I pay to bring me groceries. As for my own face, I see it reflected in the many mirrors throughout my home. Sometimes while aimlessly floating around these rooms, my reflection sneaks up on me. I jump when I see a form drifting through these gloomy, lonely waters, and then recognizing myself, I freeze and I stare at my image as if I were seeing a jellyfish. I look at the frail, nervous person wrapped in her usual brown dress. I haven't bothered to wear black. Her unkempt ebony braids cascading down her back in the old-fashioned way, her face wan, her skin dark, her eyes big and bright, anticipating, as is her wont, the appearance of ghosts, the casting of spells. And I ask myself, who is this woman? Who is this Elisa? Often, as I used to do as a child, I turn away from the mirror, hoping that when I turn back, I will see an entirely different self. Since the death of my second mother, the only person who praised me, who even considered me beautiful, my old aversion to my body has returned and grows stronger by the day.
Ottimo, grazie. I don't know if Anne wants to introduce the second reading. Yes.
It's just, it's near the beginning of the book. The narrator of this is from The Lying Life of Adults, Ferrante's new novel. It's told from the point of view of a 12-year-old girl whose father has just told her that he finds her, that she's turning ugly, or that she's starting to look like his sister. And she's living with her middle-class family in an upper-class, middle-class neighborhood of Naples. Her father has separated himself from his lower-class origins, and he is now taking her to visit her aunt, his sister, from whom he's estranged.
Ok. Uscì dall'auto, entrai nel portone. C'era un odore forte di spazzatura misto al profumo di sughi domenicali. Non vidi ascensore. Salì per le scale dai gradini sconnessi. Le pareti mostravano ampie ferite bianche. Una era così profonda che sembrava un buco scavato per nascondersi qualcosa. Evitai di decifrare scritti e disegni osceni. Avevo altre urgenze. Mio padre era stato bambino e ragazzo in questo edificio. Contai i piani. Al terzo mi fermai. C'erano 3 porte. Quella sulla mia destra era l'unica che esponeva un cognome. Sul legno c'era incollata una striscetta di carta dove era scritto a penna, Trada. Suonai il campanello. Trattenni il respiro. Niente. Contai lentamente fino a 40. Mio padre mi aveva detto qualche anno prima che ogni volta che si è in una condizione di incertezza bisogna fare a quel modo. Quando arrivai a 41, suonai di nuovo. La seconda scarica elettrica sembrò esageratamente forte. Mi arrivò un grido in dialetto, un'esplosione di suoni rochi. E che cazzo, vai a pressa, sto arrivando. Poi passi decisi, una chiave che girava ben 4 volte nella toppa. La porta si aprì. Comparve una donna tutta vestita di celeste, alta, una gran massa di capelli nerissimi fissati sulla nuca, sottile come un'alice salata e tuttavia con le spalle larghe e un gran petto. Aveva tra le dita una sigaretta accesa. Tossì, disse oscillando tra l'italiano e il dialetto. Che succede? Stai male? Devi pisciare? No. E allora perché suoni 2 volte? Mormorai. Sono Giovanna, zia. Lo so che sei Giovanna, ma se mi chiami zia un'altra volta è meglio che giri le spalle e te ne vai. Feci cenno di sì. Ero atterrita. Le guardai per pochi secondi il viso senza trucco. Poi fissai il pavimento. Vittoria mi sembrò di una bellezza così insopportabile che considerarla brutta diventava una necessità.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I got out of the car, went through the entrance. There was a strong odor of garbage mixed with the aroma of Sunday sauces. I didn't see an elevator. I climbed up uneven, broken steps beside walls showing broad white wounds, one so deep it seemed like a hole dug out to hide something. I avoided deciphering obscene sayings and drawings. I had other urgencies. My father had been a child and a boy in this building. I counted the floors. On the 3rd I stopped. There were 3 doors. The one on my right was the only one that displayed a surname, and pasted to the wood was a strip of paper on which was written in pen, Trada. I rang the bell, held my breath. Nothing. I counted slowly to 40. My father had told me some years earlier that whenever you're in a state of uncertainty, you should do that. When I got to 41, I rang again. The second electrical charge seemed exaggeratedly loud. A shout in dialect reached me, an explosion of hoarse sounds, and goddamn it, what's the hurry, I'm coming. Then decisive steps, a key that turned 4 times in the lock. The door opened, a woman dressed all in blue appeared, tall, with a great mass of very black hair arranged on her neck, as thin as a post, and yet with broad shoulders and a large chest. She held a lighted cigarette between her fingers. She coughed and said, moving back and forth between Italian and dialect, "What's the matter? You're sick? You have to pee?" "No." "So why'd you ring twice?" I murmured, "I'm Giovanna, Aunt." "I know you're Giovanna, but if you call me Aunt again, you'd better turn right around and get out of here." I nodded yes. I was frightened. I looked for a few seconds at her face, without makeup, then stared at the floor. Vittoria seemed to me to have a beauty so unbearable that to consider her ugly became a necessity. Thanks.
Great. So we have heard 2 completely different rhythms in the original text, and also of course in the translation, which is, I think, the most difficult thing to achieve, try to get the same kind of flow, syntactical flow and rhythm of the texts. So I don't know, would you like to stop for a few minutes and have the coffee that Duncan promised, and come back with a question? I've seen that there are already a couple of good, interesting questions. So we might just stop a few minutes and come back, if that is okay with the organizers. I guess so. That's the way we planned.
Oh, there's Duncan.
Yes, please do.
Okay, so it's 5 o'clock now. We'll be back in 10 minutes. Is that okay? so everybody can grab a cup of coffee and a cup of tea or whatever. Okay, we'll be back. Thank you. So coffee break time is over. We are back to work, so to say. We have a couple of questions here. I don't know, would you, Jenny or Anne, would you like to read the questions? Should I read the questions aloud or?
Why don't you read them, Franco?
Okay, so the first one is quite long and is by Michele Hudson. And I'd like to ask Anne to respond to these comments from a review of Ferrante's Lying Life of Adults. It was published on a blog. And the quotation says, "I've come to realize that Goldstein favors a translation that lets the original language show through. I confess that syntactical or lexical calques can join me out of the storytelling universe, but given how accomplished the rest of the translation is, I can only assume that these are deliberate choices. Conversely, I greatly appreciated Goldstein's approach to dealing with places and dialect. I much prefer for street names and for examples, the names of dishes or delicacies to remain in the original language. And this is the method that Goldstein favors. As for the instance of dialect, I don't know whether or not they appear in Neapolitan dialect in the original text, but Goldstein deals with conversation in dialect very sensitively, avoiding any kind of adaptation and instead dealing with them in a more subtle way. The questions. Does Anne favors the original language showing through? And the second question, how did she deal with places and dialects?
I guess I do favor the original language showing through. Sometimes, you know, sometimes just words, the translation seems more, to translate something seems harder to understand than using an Italian word. For example, I mean, the example that I've used other times is in the Neapolitan novels, there's this stradone, which literally means a big street or a large street or a wide street. And it comes up many times in the book, and to keep repeating the wide street just seemed ridiculous after a while. So I decided to call it, you know, to explain what it was in the first instance and then leave it in Italian. So yes, it does give a, plus I think it's not bad to have a little bit of the original language. And it's true what she says about the syntax as well. I mean, I do sometimes leave the syntax, it's awkward in English, but it's a little, you know, it's a little awkward in Italian. I mean, it's not, it's deliberate on the part of the author, all those run-on sentences, which I assume is what the person is talking about. Whether, I mean, the blogger, or not Michelle Hutchison, right? Or, well, anyway, whatever. You know, I think that it's, that her style is often, it's those, in those difficult sentences, it's deliberate. She wants to show something, to get somewhere. So I sometimes try to, not always, but try to recreate that in English, which, yeah, it's can be awkward. What's the second part? Oh, so Ferrante doesn't really, as Jenny said, Ferrante doesn't write in dialect very much. She uses dialect words here and there. Mm-hmm. But I mean, people say, I don't know, the Italians can probably answer this question, that, that there is a kind of Neapolitan or dialectal cadence in her writing, at least in some parts of it, which of course I don't think I could ever possibly capture in English. But when it comes to dialogue, I think there is, you know, there's sort of a loosening of rules anyway, and it could be more colloquial.
So I just wanted to add here that when we were translating Ortesi, because we felt like the dialect was so integral to the text itself and so much, gave so much of its heart and spirit, we actually ended up leaving quite a bit of the dialect in the translation, with either integrating the translation into the text of the dialogue of the dialect, or just I don't know, did we put parentheses after sometimes?
I think we sometimes did, but mostly we would just have it be repeated in English.
In English, yeah,
Yeah.
which I am a huge advocate of that. I'm also, so when I was translating Family Lexicon, of course, there's lots of dialect in there. And in some cases, I got really stumped. And I finally went to Natalia's son, Carlo Ginsberg, the historian. And I said, this Barbison, which is the name of an uncle, and it was in dialect, and it meant the guy with the big beard. Barbison, how do I translate? I can't call him the guy. In another translation, they translated it as whiskers. I didn't want to do that. I was like, what do I do with this Barbison? And he said, you know, Jenny, sometimes preserving language difference is a really great thing to do. Leave it, Barbison. And I did, and it just freed me up for a lot as a translator. And then subsequently, I've also read David Bellos on preserving foreign soundingness in translation. And so now I'm a huge advocate of trying to preserve as much foreign soundingness as possible.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, nicknames are actually a good example of that. You know, do you translate the nickname or do you just leave the nickname?
Sure.
Even if you're going to lose Barba.
You're going to lose something. Yeah, right. You are going to lose.
But you're going to gain this rhythm, as you were talking about, Franco.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes, or often I find rhythm trumps, sorry to use that word, but trumps sense.
Yeah, but also sometimes the translation wouldn't have the same effect as the nickname in the original language, in Italian, I'm talking about. But like, I don't know, the Ragazzi di Vita is full of, every character has a nickname. And I think in the earlier translation, they were translated. And they to me, it just sounds it sounded heavy-handed. I mean, I don't think it sounded heavy-handed in Italian.
Mm-hmm.
They're called ricetto.
Yeah, right. Become natural.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a passage in the, just a sentence in the passage we read by Ferrante in Neapolitan dialect, when she says, "Che cazzo vai e pressa?"
Yeah.
Which I didn't understand because I'm not from Naples. So
Right.
I had to work it out, say what's she saying? So that means, you know, you're going too quickly. Are you in a hurry? Something like that.
Yeah.
That's typical
Yeah,
Neapolitan.
right.
It comes in the sentence, right in the middle with no
With no, right,
just-
that's true. She does, yeah, there is that.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, and it's true. That's another thing was the fact that other Italians wouldn't understand the dialect of another.
Yeah, I figured it out when I read it aloud.
Yeah,
What
sure.
was she talking about? Then all of a sudden, I realized that what she meant.
Yeah.
Oh, good. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as you
In a hurry.
probably know, the TV show of Ferrante had was shot in Neapolitan and has subtitles in Italian.
Sure. Okay, let's move to the other questions. There is one by Rosaria Manuela Di Stefano, and she asked, first of all, thanks for sharing your experience. And my question are, one, how much can an editor, knowing both languages, make a difference on the quality of the final result versus one only knowing the target language? So this is about the editors. And the second, the non-native speakers. Well, let's answer this question first. The second one is—
It's a fascinating question. It's a really—
Yeah, I know.
Go ahead, Anne, you start.
Well, I mean, first of all, there's Barbara Epler, who's the editor of New Directions, who famously, I guess, knows no other languages. And she edits a lot of translations. And she thinks that it's really helpful not to know the other languages because she can edit as if she's reading a manuscript in English. And she can find, and you know, she'll find, I guess, I haven't been edited by her, but I mean, people say she's a great editor, which I think she probably is.
And when it sounds off, she just says, okay, go back and think about this again.
Yeah. I mean, the advantage of an editor who knows both languages is, first of all, they can save you from mistakes. And believe me, in a 400 or 500 page novel, you are
800
bound, or 800 page novel, you're bound to make mistakes.
colors.
But, and, you know, if the person is a sensitive reader, they will also find the place, you know, they'll notice the places that are not working. So there's advantages both ways.
There is a potential disadvantage to the editor who also speaks.
Yes, that's
like in true. That, as we know, you can translate things very many different ways. So if you have an editor who starts doubting all of your choices,
yeah, that's
and
true.
thinks they could do it better, then
yeah.
it starts to become problematic. So you need a real sensitive editor, but it is an advantage.
Yeah. No, but actually, when I was editing Primo Levi, sometimes with some of the translations, I would start, you know, doing just what you said, like saying, no, this is how it should be, or this is how it should be. And then I thought, wait a second, that's not right. You know, that's not necessarily how it should be. And I could see how the translator arrived at what he or she arrived at. And then I thought, oh, well, you know, that also makes sense. I mean, so you're right. It's a hazard.
It takes a very, because as in teaching translation, obviously.
Yeah, you must
come across with the Italians, you know, and a lot you really have to back off and then really only look for things that are actual mistakes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, in the beginning of your conversation, you mentioned the difference between correcting and editing. I know this is going to be a very stupid theoretical question, but is there a difference between the two? Why did you say there is a difference between correcting and editing? What's the difference between the two, if I may ask?
I mean, I guess what I meant was that, I mean, it was really referring to the fact that if the editor knows both languages, that person can have more of a correcting function in the sense of literally you've got something wrong, or you misinterpreted something, can see where you've made a wrong interpretation or a wrong.
That the sense.
That the sense is wrong, the meaning is wrong.
Okay.
I think that's all.
Okay. The second part of the question, non-native speakers are usually discouraged from translating into languages other than their own. Is there a case or any circumstances in which this might not be true? What is needed to translate a literary work that might be unreachable for a non-native?
Again, it is a fascinating question, and it is something that comes up a lot for me in my teaching, because there are quite a few people students who do want to translate into languages that are not their, original language or mother tongue or whatever. And, I think it's all possible. I mean, we have very good examples of it being done and being done well, Nabokov and Conrad and Jhumpa Lahiri. So I encourage it, and I think it's wonderful. I do think it's it's hugely difficult. I couldn't do it, I don't think, unless I don't know how Jhumpa did it. It's what it is, I think, again, is going back to this idea of intuition. Like my intuition in English, I think I'm very confident about it. I really believe in it. Whereas my intuition in Italian is less. So I don't know if I would have that competency to bring to that translation. I don't know how you feel about that.
No, I agree. I would never translate into Italian. I mean, of course I translate into Italian informally, but I would never do it. I'd never do what Jhumpa did or is doing.
It's amazing. But no, I think, yes, if you want to do it and have the drive. I mean, another competency I wanted to add to the Petra is framework is kind of obsessive compulsive disorder. I mean, as a translator, you have to be so obsessive and go over again and again and again the sentence until it, as I say a lot, sings. So, you really, and you'd have to do that the other way as well if you're translating it out into a different language. And the other one I was thinking of is passion. Like you need real passion for whatever it is that you're translating.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. We have another question here. What are the advantages, disadvantages attached to being permanently resident in the country from whose language you translate?
Well, since I don't reside in the country whose language I translate, I think it would be wonderful to be a resident of that country. And that it would be, you know, in many ways it would be helpful, because you would, you know, you miss, if you're not a, I miss the language of living there. You know, you don't hear that. I don't hear that. I mean, I read in Italian all the time, and I have a few friends with whom I speak Italian, but it's not the same as living there and having it around you all the time.
It's true. The subtleties, the inflections, all of that, just with the language, but also just absorbing the culture.
And the culture, yeah.
Everything about it, it just helps with the translation. However, that said, I mean, I really do feel like translation is all about the language you're translating into.
Right.
So as Anne was saying earlier, you know, she always brings English books with her when she comes over here. I mean, you also need total immersion in your own language, because you can't, sometimes when I'm over in Italy and I've been here for a long time, and then I go back to the United States, people say that I start using my sentence structure starts changing a little bit. My syntax is a little off. So, you know, because there's some things you're saying that you're actually translating in your head back from Italian into English. You know, see, it is, I don't think there's a perfect place to be a translator.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask you again if you can explain better what you mean with intuition, because I'm afraid that this could be sort of a false friend with Italians.
Oh.
Just can specify a little bit better. What is intuition for a translator, or for you? I mean, what do you mean when you say intuition?
Well, there's some very specific things, like, I mean, on a very sort of practical level, take the big red car. So if in another language, we don't know where big or red comes, maybe it's the red big car.
Mm-hmm.
The red big car to somebody an English speaker sounds weird. So I know it's the big red car, but I have that just because of it's an intuitive kind of thing, that I know that it's about sound. I know how it sounds and how the rhythm is and how it is, you know, and that is where I mean, that's what I'm meaning on a practical level, intuition. Mm. And then on a bigger level, it's sort of more global level. It's, sort of a feeling for the English language and what I can get away with. So maybe I do sometimes say the red big car, but I'm doing it on purpose because this, that, or the other thing. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that gets us any closer, Anne. You want to
yeah, no, that's what it is. I mean, it's sort of, I mean, it's sort of a learned intuition in a way. It's what you've learned from reading and listening to English all your life. And it gives you an intuitive sense of what sounds right, what sounds good.
Say natural proficiency, something like.
It's somewhat, yeah. I mean, for me, a lot of it also, I mean, I think probably is from years of being a copy editor at the New Yorker. I sort of absorbed certain ways of saying things, and sometimes I catch myself overdoing it. I say, wait a second, this is like a New Yorker sentence. Maybe this isn't really what this writer.
Yeah, I suppose in a way also, like an analogy to painting, if you're, very representational and have everything exactly proportional and right and so on, and you really know how that all works in perspective and you've got it just all down, then you can start getting more abstract. But you need to have all of that in place, and then you can sort of use your intuition to be more abstract in the language. Your intuition is going to tell you more about what the possibilities of the language are and still be correct.
Right, perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you. So another, I don't know if we have other questions here from the participants. Let's see. Yes, Veronica Vecchi. How did you overcome language and text difficulties at the beginning of your career in translation, considering you were working on authors who sometimes are not so easy to understand either for the mother tongues?
How do you mean?
It's-
How do we do that?
How did you overcome the language and text difficulties at the beginning
I mean,
of your translation?
just by reading over and over and over again. Sometimes, I mean, certainly asking people, asking Italians and getting sometimes, as Jenny said earlier, you know, different answers. But just, I think, I mean, we didn't really get into this, but I am sort of analytical about the way I work, at least in the first stages. So I have a belief that if I can break down the sentence well enough into its real exact grammatical parts, I'm going to understand what it means. And then I call on Jenny to give it some flair.
I think it's just all about, as I was saying before, I think it's all about getting used to failure. I mean, you have to do it wrong and badly, and also obsessive compulsive. So you,
Right.
especially until you, especially at the beginning, when you're really feeling like, how can I be doing this? So you just hammer at it and keep going until it does feel to you like it works on the page, and it's created something that is in the spirit of the original that you can be proud of. And that just takes work. I think it's true for anything that anybody does, translation, anything. It's work.
Perfect. Alessandra Petrelli, earlier during this course, we came to speak about footnotes and glossaries. What do you think about them? Would you use them in your translations? Thank you.
So I am a huge fan of footnotes. Now, a lot of translators and a lot of publishers really don't like them, but I, especially in family, in everything I do, because a lot about translation is also research, right? Because there's a word and you want to know everything about that word or phrase, so you go down rabbit holes of research, and sometimes you turn up these most amazing references that the author's making, and you want to, maybe the original or the readership in the original language would get it, and the English language wouldn't. So I put footnotes all over the place. So then New York Review Books was like, what are all these footnotes? So then they put them as endnotes, so you don't know that they're there. So recently I was doing something on the Ginsberg Book Club or something, and they're like, why didn't you tell us there were the footnotes? We didn't know about them until we got to the end of the book. So you can't win, but I think they're great.
Yeah. I mean, I usually think that in novels, it's better not to have footnotes. I'm not really against endnote. I mean, of course, there's all that information. And Primo Levi, there are footnotes, not a lot. There's also essays at the end that explain a lot of the references. But in some cases, we used footnotes. In some cases, it's possible to explain a reference in the text, like just to add some identifying word or even an explanation of something. But Levi, for example, is full of references to Dante. And you couldn't really, you could just write a separate essay about the references, I guess. And a couple of places we put footnotes, and a couple of places we just let the reader hope for the best, let the reader find out. So yeah, it's complicated.
We have a question from Veronica Boker, and it's something I wanted to ask you anyway, so it's perfect. Can you say a little bit more about your experience of translating an unfinished work? Thank you. You mentioned some unfinished work you've been working on, Malaparte, I think.
Oh, yeah, Malaparte.
But in general. And then I was reading a few days ago an interview that Anne gave to somebody, I don't remember to whom, and you were mentioning that you like to work on grammatical violation and syntactical knots. This is what you said, that I read it somewhere, which
I
is,
did.
well, you did, which is connected to this question in a way. An unfinished work probably is full of this kind of grammatical violation or things that have to be decided better, to be refined. So so the question is, tell us a little bit more about your experience of translating an unfinished work. Or
Well, really, I think Petrolio is really the only unfinished work that I've worked on. And as I said, that was quite an experience because it's, well, the structure, first of all, the structure is unfinished. I mean, it's all those different parts, and sometimes it's the same part that's restarted again, and you're not sure if he would have redone it and if the language should repeat. Then there are the places where he hasn't decided on the word, and he actually uses these, in the text, there are these slashes where do you remember this? Where he'll put in like different versions of a phrase or a word. So it's, in some ways it's kind of liberating because you can, you've got two choices there. It's really great. You don't have to make that final decision. So it's perhaps a little freer, but I think there's also a responsibility in a way to be closer to the unfinished text because you don't know what direction it's going to go in. You don't want to be the one deciding how that text was going to be finished.
Sure.
So, yeah. So I guess those are syntactical knots.
The way I think about it too, I mean, previously I was saying about, if you're a translator, you're really interested in language and you're really interested in how an author comes to make decisions in writing. But it's a very intimate relationship between the translator and the author, even if the author's dead. So, because you're getting really inside their head in a way that you don't get inside anybody else's head in your life, really, I mean, through their language. And when it's unfinished, you're actually getting the privilege of really seeing their process in a different way than when it's finished. And for me as a writer, so I'm a writer too, to watch that process in its really raw form, and then to be intimately involved in it is just fascinating. For me, it's completely fascinating to watch how it goes from that very sort of rough, ugly thing to something really, really beautiful.
Thank you. Lelinda Marinelli asks, hello, thank you for sharing your knowledge. Could you share something about the way you approach your work? Do you have any specific methodology to guide you along the way? That's the question. That's the problem.
That's the problem.
That's the problem. Go ahead, Anne.
Oh, well, I mean,
there's more method to your madness.
I don't think so. Well, I mean, as we mentioned, I do a very rough draft first. I do the whole book. I make a rough draft of the whole book, and it's pretty rough. I look up all the words, but and I use a lot of different dictionaries. But
just the curiosity, do you read the whole book in the original?
It depends. In the beginning, I would read the whole book, but when I was working on the Neapolitan novels, the time frame was so tight that after the first one, I didn't. I translated as I read. And that's actually kind of fun. I mean, it gives you this kind of immediacy of you're experiencing the book as you're typing, as you're translating. So it's kind of interesting. So I don't always read the book. I just don't always have time. I mean, it's hard to think that translations have a deadline, but sometimes they do.
I very purposefully try not to read the book before I translate. Really? Yeah, because as a writer, I do know that the element of surprise and of freshness, or as you were saying, fun, does come with that original not knowing when you're reading. So when you're writing, maybe somehow you're getting that spirit of discovery.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. The translation. So that's why I like to do that. But
Yeah.
And then in terms of just daily process, I mean, it's the true about anything. The more you do it on a regular schedule, the more it'll get done. So I just try and make sure that I do a certain amount a day if I can.
Yeah, yeah, I do too. And, you know, we do, I think this is true for you too. I mean, I just do many drafts.
And then many drafts. Actually, for me, it all happens in the editing. And that's true of my original work too, my novels. Editing it's all there. It's not in what you get on the page originally. It's when you're doing all the work in the editing and the sculpting and the making each sentence exactly the way you want it. That's where it all happens for me anyway.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Okay, let's move to another question.
That's why I teach a course in editing for literary translators, by the way.
Which is very important, yes. So Bethan Atfield, people usually say a good translation should read like it was written in the original in the target language. Let's see, let me read it again because there is a correction here. People usually say a good translation should read like it was written in the target language. But I think earlier in your talk, you contradicted that. If so, please explain why. Then he says, I mean originally written. Okay.
Oh, I see.
Well, now you would have to get going. I mean, I will get going on my sort of philosophy of translation and so on and so forth, more theoretical. But, you know, in a way, I almost don't believe in original. So I think that every creation, a translation is its own creation. If Anne and I translated the same book, each would be very different and its own thing. So the whole idea of actually having it be something that is possible to make exact toward whatever the original was is actually not an ambition of mine, nor do I think it really should be an ambition of translation.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, it shouldn't, it's almost sounds contradictory to say the sentences should read like English, but you should know that it's from another language at the same time. So I don't know. I don't think it should read exact. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if I believe that about the original, but you're right, I guess. It's, every work is its own work.
Next question then. This is more about the work, the translation as a job. Considering the writer of the book you are translating likely wrote without a fixed deadline, do you think translators should have far longer deadlines to spend adequate time on the writing skill involved in translating it?
Sure.
Why not?
That said, there's nothing like a deadline. I mean, a deadline gets you to, you know, really focus. Mm-hmm. However, I do think that the expectation for translations is often shorter than it should be in terms of, you know, you should translate this in 3 months or whatever. And it's taken the author 10 years to write. That ratio seems a little off to me, but yeah.
Flavia Venditelli. Being a writer and a translator are very different things. As an author, how do you approach translation? Do you think it is more difficult for a writer to translate another's work, the work of another person?
So actually, I do not feel that being an author or a translator are that different. I feel like all writers should be translators and are translating on some level into what they've learned, what their world is. All the writers that have come before them are always within the texts somehow. So there's, you know, a kind of philosophical translation activity happening if you're writing something quote unquote original, or if you're translating something from an original. So to me, though, translation is all the fun and wondrous things of writing, but you don't have the blank page. Nor do you have the burden of creation. You do have creation, but you don't have the burden of, oh, does this make, is this meaningful enough to, are people going to like this? Or, you still have that in translation, actually. But yeah, you don't have the burden of creation.
But it's also true that especially Italian authors in the 20th century, many of them were translators, or they did both.
Yes.
So I don't think
European writers.
Yeah.
Only Americans who are.
Yeah, I mean, Americans are benighted in that sense.
Yeah. I mean, language is language. And it teaches you so much. That's the other thing, is nothing has taught me more about writing than translation.
Right.
So it just teaches you so much about what it is to be a writer.
I'd like to go back to another topic, the collaborative translation. I mean, you have been working together, but did you have other experiences, maybe more organized as far as collaborative translation is concerned?
So we did the Anna Maria Ortese in terms of translating together.
Mm-hmm.
That's the only one we've done. We keep looking around for what's next.
Yeah.
Okay. Would you call collaborative translation the translation done with the help of the author, or just like a suicide kind of experience?
Well, actually, yeah, that's true. You could talk about that a little bit, Anne, with Jhumpa.
Mm.
Oh, yes, that's true. I mean, that was when I translated her. First of all, I was puzzled by why she wanted it translated, why she didn't want to translate it in altre parole herself. But then I sort of understood. But yes, I mean, I knew that I wasn't going to write the English of Jhumpa Lahiri. So I wrote my English, and then she went over it, of course, and she had quite a few. Actually, the things that she changed were mostly words. So, which could have, a word that could mean one thing or another thing, and then I put one thing, and then she changed it to another thing. I mean, which was fine. I mean, we talked about it, and it was interesting, actually.
I do think, though, that would be its own thing if you're going to really collaborate with the translator and a living author.
Mm-hmm.
But that was so particular.
Yeah.
Jhumpa. I haven't collaborated with other authors. I mean, with Italian, native Italian speaking authors. Have you? No, not really.
No, I have, as an author, I have had a really fantastic experience with both my Italian and my Dutch translators, where they're showing me things that I didn't even know were really happening in my novels. So I've had fabulous relationships that way, but I never really got very involved in the actual, nitty gritty of the language. It was just dealing with their questions and for me, but I found the experience fabulous.
Yeah, well, a German translator, I'm not sure who it was, I think it was Ross Benjamin, somebody once said that the author he was translating said to him, no one is going to read my work as closely as you have.
That's right. Exactly.
So it's like a great compliment to the work.
And of course I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but there's Gabriel Garcia Marquez who said about Rabassa's translation of 100 Years of Solitude, read it in English, it's a better book.
We have another question by Giulio Sanseverino. Thanks for this beautiful talk. My question is, how did you choose the translation process for your collaborative work? Did you consider any other alternative methods at first?
It was part of our original project, I think, because we'd worked together on Levi and Pasolini. So we knew what it was like to work together and be edited by each other. So I edited her on Petrolio and she me on Levi. And we had so much fun. I mean, we really had a great time doing those. But then on the Ortese, we wanted to do a deeper merge.
Yeah.
So we did start out with the plan of this, really dirty first draft that we would switch, and that we would keep switching so that our voices merged in Ortese. So it became a kind of triangulated experience. Is that right, Anne?
Yes. Sorry. Yes. No. That's very much how it was. That we and as Jenny we said earlier, we in the end we didn't know who wrote which sentence. We couldn't have recreated that.
And did you sign the translation together? So the translation was signed by both of you.
Yes.
What about Leopardi? I saw that both of you worked on Leopardi. Was just by, but I don't know. I'm not familiar with that translation. So.
The Zibaldone?
Yeah. Did you work with the group that translated
it? The group. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So.
Yeah, it was a group that had that was a very organized group.
Yeah. No. In fact, no. So I just wanted to know if you were part of that group, which was a challenging, collaborative translation in a way.
That was definitely a collaborative translation. Yeah. Yeah.
There were two scholars, Franco
Gantino,
and Caesar.
Like Caesar.
In
England.
And they were really, they did I didn't do that much. The rest of everybody else did a lot.
I didn't even,
But they would take what we gave them and they would be all over it. So it was a heavily edited collaboration. It was great. It was really interesting. They all met. I got sick, but they all met.
Yeah, we had a meeting at the beginning.
In Leopardi's hometown.
No, well, it was a little away from there in Alghi. And they had word lists. They had
a glossary.
And how we should translate certain words in certain contexts. Which was incredibly helpful because some of us were kind of pretty ignorant about the Zibaldone.
Yeah. And so did you have the chance to get together with the other translators? Or
we did. It was in the beginning. All the translators got together except for Jenny, who was sick.
I was so sick.
Which was amazing, just to talk to all the other translators. It was a little bit unfortunate that it was at the beginning rather than when we had more experience of working on it, because I think we would have had more questions and more to discuss. But it was amazing.
That was a great enterprise.
That was amazing. Yeah, I know. It was really.
And they did it relatively quickly. It was amazing. That was amazing. That was an organizational feat. Yeah.
Yeah. Unlike the Primo Levi, which dragged on.
That was too.
Oh, it dragged on.
Okay, I don't see any other questions, and the time is running. It's almost 6 o'clock. Duncan, maybe you can jump in and.
I can certainly jump in. Thank you all so much. That was such an inspiring afternoon's conversation. The number of questions, I think, is a testament to how engaged our audience has been in your conversation. Thank you for the generosity of your answers in the Q&A in part 2 as well. And I feel as if we've really put you through your paces in the question and answer session. So that's a hugely valuable discussion and many things for us to take away. So thank you on behalf of all of us. Thank you, Franco, for your chairing. Those of us who are part of the ESLT will be reconvening tomorrow at 9:30 Italian time. But in the meantime, thank you all once again, and have, well, in the case of our two speakers, have a wonderful rest of day, but over on this side of the pond, it's have a wonderful evening. Thank you all.
Our
Okay.
pleasure. Thank you.
Yes, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
I wish we would have been able to see everybody, but
Yeah.
anyway, I feel you there.
Yeah.